Authorities say the Melodee Buzzard case is not just the story of a missing child, but a carefully documented sequence of decisions that led to a devastating outcome. What began as a routine school absence in California quickly escalated into a multi-state investigation involving local law enforcement, federal agencies, and forensic specialists. As evidence accumulated, investigators say the focus shifted to the person closest to the child, her own mother, raising troubling questions about intent, responsibility, and trust. According to officials, the facts reveal actions that were neither accidental nor spontaneous. Instead, they describe a pattern of movement, concealment, and avoidance that unfolded over several days and across multiple states. This report examines the verified timeline released by authorities. The evidence, they say, supports the arrest, and why investigators believe this case represents a profound breach of parental duty, one that ended with a child losing her life. Melodee Buzzard was 9 years old when concerns about her safety first reached authorities. The alarm was not raised by a dramatic emergency call, but by something far quieter, a prolonged absence from her school program in Santa Barbara County, California. Administrators noticed that Melodee had not been participating as expected and reported the issue, triggering what initially appeared to be a routine welfare check. When deputies arrived at the family residence, they expected a simple explanation. Instead, they were met with silence and vague responses. According to investigators, Melodee's mother, Ashlee Buzzard, did not provide clear or verifiable information about where her daughter was or when she would return. That lack of transparency immediately elevated concern among law enforcement. At this early stage, there was no public indication of a serious crime. Still, investigators noted something was wrong. Children do not simply disappear without explanation, and responsible caregivers are expected to assist when questions arise. Detectives began documenting every interaction carefully, understanding that early details often shape the entire course of an investigation. As days passed, Melodee remained unseen. No friends, relatives, or school officials had contact with her. Investigators expanded their efforts, attempting to reconstruct the child's recent routine and living situation. What they found raised additional concerns about isolation and limited outside oversight. Authorities learned that Melodee had been enrolled in an independent study program shortly before her disappearance. While such programs are legal, they can also reduce daily visibility into a child's well-being. Detectives considered this factor carefully, especially given the absence of required documentation for earlier schooling periods. When questioned again, Ashlee Buzzard reportedly declined to offer details that could confirm Melodee's safety. Investigators noted that cooperation was limited, forcing them to rely on evidence rather than testimony. This shift marked a critical turning point, from welfare check to potential criminal inquiry. Search warrants were soon authorized for the family residence and associated property. Law enforcement began collecting physical and digital evidence, including travel records, rental agreements, and surveillance data. Each item was logged, preserved, and analyzed as part of a growing investigative picture. One discovery quickly stood out: evidence suggesting recent travel beyond California. Investigators learned that a rental vehicle had been used and that the travel extended across several states. This raised immediate concern, as no credible explanation had been provided for why a child would be taken on such a trip without notice. As detectives mapped the route, patterns began to emerge. Surveillance footage and transaction records suggested intentional movement rather than casual travel. Authorities noted behaviors that appeared designed to reduce traceability, prompting deeper scrutiny of the trip's purpose. Community concern grew rapidly. Relatives, neighbors, and volunteers gathered outside the home, holding signs and asking a simple question: where is Melodee? Despite growing public attention, investigators say they continued to receive no verifiable proof that the child was safe. The case soon drew national attention, with true crime observers tracking every development. Law enforcement, however, emphasized that speculation was not helpful. Their focus remained on evidence, timestamps, locations, and verified facts. Investigators identified the last confirmed sighting of Melodee through surveillance footage near the Utah-Colorado border. The image showed a child traveling with her mother. After that moment, there were no further confirmed appearances. Detectives now believe that whatever happened to Melodee occurred shortly after that sighting. This conclusion was not based on assumption, but on a convergence of travel data, surveillance gaps, and later forensic findings. Meanwhile, law enforcement intensified their search along the return route. Rather than focusing only on where the child had been seen, investigators examined where she was no longer present, a method often used when concealment is suspected. During this period, authorities noted actions that suggested deliberate avoidance of detection. These included changes to vehicle identifiers and positioning choices meant to limit camera exposure. Investigators later described these behaviors as purposeful rather than incidental. Searches extended to storage units and additional properties linked to the suspect. Each location was processed methodically, with evidence teams documenting items that could later be compared to findings elsewhere. As weeks passed, hope remained that Melodee would be found alive. Officials publicly stated they were working with urgency and compassion, aware of the emotional toll on the community. That hope began to fade in early December, when authorities in Utah reported the discovery of human remains in a remote area. The location was isolated, far from major roads, and unlikely to be reached by accident. Forensic analysis began immediately. Investigators worked carefully, knowing that confirmation would bring devastating clarity. When results came back, they aligned with the timeline investigators had already constructed. The remains were identified as Melodee Buzzard through DNA testing. Officials also confirmed presence of injuries consistent with intentional harm, marking a tragic end to the search. At this stage, investigators stated that the evidence clearly pointed back to the child's mother. What began as unanswered questions had become a case built on documented actions, physical evidence, and forensic confirmation. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they emphasized that the case was not defined by a single moment, but by a sequence of deliberate decisions. Each action, taken alone, might have appeared minor. Together, authorities say they revealed a sustained effort to control information, limit visibility, and delay discovery. Central to that timeline was the cross-country trip taken in early October. According to law enforcement, the journey was not random. Travel records, receipts, and surveillance footage allowed detectives to chart a clear route across multiple states, both outbound and on the return. The consistency of this data left little room for uncertainty. Investigators say particular attention was paid to how the trip was conducted. Evidence showed the use of a rental vehicle rather than a personal car. This choice, officials noted, complicated immediate identification and tracking, especially across state lines where coordination takes time. Surveillance footage later released to the public showed both the mother and child wearing wigs at a rental location. Detectives described this as an unusual and concerning detail, suggesting an awareness of being observed and a desire to avoid recognition. Additional footage and witness accounts indicated that the vehicle was often positioned to reduce camera exposure, including backing into fuel stations. Authorities stated that such behavior aligned with an effort to limit traceable images rather than simple coincidence. Investigators also discovered that license plates on the rental vehicle were switched during the trip. This action, officials said, further disrupted tracking efforts and demonstrated a willingness to take risks to avoid detection. As detectives examined the return route, they identified the last confirmed visual record of the child near the Utah-Colorado border. After that point, Melodee was no longer seen on any known surveillance system. Investigators say this absence was significant. Based on travel timing and later findings, authorities believe the child did not return to California alive. This conclusion was reached gradually, supported by location data, fuel stops, and the absence of subsequent sightings. While the search continued publicly, investigators quietly focused on areas along the return path where movement patterns changed. Such shifts, they noted, often indicate an effort to divert attention from a critical location. Weeks later, when human remains were discovered in a remote part of Utah, detectives immediately compared the location to their mapped timeline. The site fell within a zone they had already identified as relevant. Forensic teams processed the area carefully. According to officials, the location's isolation suggested intentional placement rather than accidental discovery. The remains were not near populated areas or commonly traveled roads. Ballistics analysis became a key component of the case. Cartridge cases recovered from the Utah site were later compared to evidence found during earlier searches in California. Experts determined the items were linked. This connection, investigators said, provided physical evidence tying the crime scene to the suspect's residence. Combined with travel records, the findings strengthened the case significantly. DNA testing later confirmed the identity of the remains. Authorities described the confirmation as devastating but necessary, allowing the investigation to move forward with clarity rather than uncertainty. Throughout the process, officials emphasized that cooperation from the suspect was minimal. When questions were unanswered, detectives relied on documentation, forensic science, and interagency collaboration. Federal agencies joined local investigators to assist with evidence processing and analysis. This coordination allowed information to be shared quickly across jurisdictions, closing gaps that often slow complex cases. As evidence accumulated, investigators described the case as one built not on assumptions, but on verifiable facts. Each piece reinforced the same conclusion, leaving little ambiguity. By mid-December, authorities stated they were confident in their findings. The pattern of movement, concealment, and forensic confirmation painted a consistent picture of intentional wrongdoing. When the arrest was finally made, officials said it followed months of disciplined investigative work. The timing reflected readiness, not urgency, ensuring the case could withstand scrutiny in court. Law enforcement acknowledged the emotional weight of the case, particularly given the age of the victim. Still, they emphasized that their responsibility was to the facts and to accountability. Part 2 of this case underscores a critical reality investigators often confront. Serious harm to children is frequently preceded by calculated decisions, not sudden chaos. Recognizing those patterns, authorities say, is essential to understanding how such tragedies unfold. In early December, the investigation reached a devastating turning point. Authorities in Utah reported the discovery of human remains in a remote area far from major roadways. The location, described as isolated and difficult to access, immediately raised concerns about intentional placement rather than chance. According to officials, the remains were found by members of the public who were not connected to the investigation. Local law enforcement secured the area and initiated standard forensic procedures, aware that the discovery could be linked to an ongoing missing child case. Within days, investigators from Utah notified authorities in California. The geographic connection matched a section of the travel route already identified during the earlier phase of the investigation. This overlap prompted immediate coordination between agencies. Forensic teams carefully documented the scene, collecting physical evidence and mapping the surrounding area. Authorities emphasized that the location's distance from populated areas suggested planning rather than coincidence, reinforcing concerns investigators had previously documented. Medical examiners later determined that the remains showed evidence of intentional harm. Officials avoided speculation, but confirmed that the findings were consistent with what investigators had feared, based on the timeline and travel data. As analysis continued, investigators compared evidence from Utah with items recovered during earlier searches in California. This included cartridge cases and other materials previously logged and preserved by evidence teams. Ballistics experts later confirmed that cartridge cases recovered near the remains were linked to ammunition found at the suspect's residence. Authorities described this connection as a critical evidentiary bridge between locations separated by hundreds of miles. DNA testing followed shortly after. Federal laboratories conducted the analysis to ensure accuracy and reliability. When results were returned, they confirmed a familial match between the remains and the suspect. Officials described the confirmation as heartbreaking, but necessary to bring clarity to the case. The search for a missing child had now transitioned into a confirmed homicide investigation. Once identity was established, investigators finalized their evidentiary review. Authorities stated that the combination of forensic findings, travel records, and surveillance footage left little uncertainty about what had occurred. On December 23rd, law enforcement executed an arrest at the suspect's residence in California. The arrest was carried out without incident, following weeks of preparation and legal review. The suspect was booked on suspicion of first-degree murder and held without bail. Officials emphasized that this decision reflected the seriousness of the charges and the strength of the evidence presented. During a press conference, the county sheriff described the case as deeply disturbing. He emphasized that the actions uncovered during the investigation demonstrated planning, awareness, and sustained effort over time. Authorities also highlighted the role of interagency cooperation. Local, state, and federal teams worked together to track movement across multiple jurisdictions, ensuring that no critical detail was overlooked. Investigators stated that cooperation from the suspect was limited throughout the case. When answers were not provided, law enforcement relied on documentation, technology, and forensic science. Community reaction intensified following the arrest. For months, volunteers and relatives had gathered outside the home seeking answers. A confirmation brought grief, but also a measure of resolution. Officials expressed condolences to the family and emphasized that the child should be remembered for her life, not the circumstances of her death. They urged the public to respect the ongoing legal process. The district attorney's office confirmed that the case would proceed through the court system. Prosecutors stated they would review the evidence carefully to ensure accountability under the law. Authorities cautioned that additional details would be limited while proceedings continue. They emphasized the importance of preserving the integrity of the case. For investigators, Part 3 of this timeline marked the moment when months of uncertainty gave way to confirmation. The outcome was tragic, but officials stressed that disciplined investigative work was essential to reaching the truth. This phase of the case underscores a stark reality. When evidence, science, and persistence align, even carefully concealed actions can be uncovered. Investigators say that principle guided their work from the first unanswered question to the final arrest. Following the arrest, authorities shifted focus from investigation to prosecution. Law enforcement officials emphasized that every step taken in the case was documented to withstand legal scrutiny. The goal, they said, was not speed, but accountability built on verifiable evidence. The suspect was booked on suspicion of first-degree murder and held without bail. Prosecutors indicated that the charge reflects the seriousness of the alleged actions and the degree of planning described by investigators. Throughout the case, officials noted that holding a suspect without bail is reserved for cases where the court believes there is a significant risk of flight or danger. In this instance, authorities cited the extensive travel across state lines as a relevant factor. As the case moves through the court system, prosecutors are expected to rely heavily on forensic evidence. Ballistics analysis, DNA confirmation, and documented travel records form the foundation of the case presented thus far. Investigators stressed that the strength of the case lies in consistency. Independent sources of evidence, surveillance footage, transaction records, and forensic testing all point to the same timeline and conclusions. During public statements, officials avoided emotional language, instead focusing on facts. They emphasized that the evidence was gathered patiently over months, ensuring that conclusions were supported rather than assumed. Authorities also addressed the challenge of investigating cases involving caregivers. They acknowledged that such cases often involve delayed reporting and limited outside visibility, complicating early intervention. The sheriff described the investigation as one of the most demanding his office had handled. He highlighted the sustained effort required to track movement across multiple jurisdictions while preserving evidentiary integrity. Prosecutors confirmed that additional charges could be considered as the case develops. However, they emphasized that decisions would be guided strictly by evidence and applicable law. Throughout the proceedings, officials reiterated that the suspect is entitled to due process. They urged the public to allow the legal system to proceed without speculation or interference. Community response has remained intense. Vigils, signs, and messages of remembrance appeared across the area where the child once lived. Authorities acknowledged the grief while urging respect for privacy. Relatives of the child expressed sorrow and disbelief following confirmation of the outcome. Officials noted that victim support services were made available to family members impacted by the case. Law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation conducted internal reviews to identify lessons learned. Officials stated that understanding how warning signs emerged is essential for future prevention. One key issue raised was the role of school attendance monitoring. Authorities noted that the initial alert came from school administrators, underscoring the importance of institutional oversight. Investigators also pointed to the challenges posed by independent study programs when safeguards are not fully enforced. Reduced visibility, they said, can delay recognition of potential risk. At the state level, officials discussed whether existing reporting mechanisms adequately protect children in non-traditional education settings. While no policy changes were announced, the case has prompted renewed discussion. Prosecutors emphasized that the legal process may take months or longer. Pretrial motions, evidence review, and court scheduling will determine the timeline, not public pressure. Authorities stated that no outcome can undo the harm done. However, they stressed that accountability remains essential to honoring the child's life and ensuring justice under the law. As the case proceeds, officials plan to limit public comment. This restraint, they said, protects the integrity of the trial and prevents misinformation from influencing proceedings. Part 4 of this case highlights a difficult reality. When harm occurs within a household, the legal system must rely on vigilance from institutions, persistence from investigators, and the careful application of the law. The case of Melodee Buzzard now stands as both a criminal prosecution and a cautionary example. Authorities say its lessons will shape how similar cases are identified, investigated, and addressed in the future. As this case moved forward through the courts, investigators say the evidence tells a clear and deeply troubling story. What began as concern over a child's absence ultimately revealed a sequence of deliberate choices that placed secrecy above safety. Authorities emphasized that the facts were established not through speculation, but through documentation, forensic science, and patient investigation across multiple states. For the public, the Melodee Buzzard case is a painful reminder that warning signs are often subtle. Changes in routine, isolation, and a lack of transparency can precede far more serious outcomes. Officials stress that early reporting by schools and institutions played a critical role in uncovering the truth, even when answers were not immediately available. Cases involving children demand careful attention, restraint, and respect for facts. Investigators urge the public to avoid rumors and allow the legal process to unfold. Accountability, they say, is achieved not through outrage, but through evidence presented clearly and tested in court. Only then can justice be pursued with integrity. If you follow true child cases to understand how these investigations unfold and how critical details are uncovered step by step, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories are shared not for shock, but to document facts, recognize warning signs, and ensure that the lives of vulnerable children are not forgotten. Staying informed helps keep attention where it matters most.